Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We're a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia, and we're a registered 501c3. Like to thank you all for coming today, and also thank our sponsors and donors, without whom events such as this would not be possible. We have an interesting program for you today. It is, I'm having trouble with my notes here. Okay, here we go. Our program today is about cybersecurity, old and new problems and the way forward. It's the third in our series on national security and related tech and cybersecurity issues. Our moderator today is Dr. Kenneth Jensen, who's a senior research associate with the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He was a founding member, officer in the corporation, and the first director of research at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And from 1995 to 2010, he was also the executive director of the American Committees on Foreign Relations. His guest today is Paul Rosenzweig, who is the founder of Red Branch Consulting, PLLC, a Homeland Security consulting company and a senior fellow at the R Street Institute. He's also senior advisor to the Chertoff Group. He formerly served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy in the Department of Homeland Security and is a professorial lecturer of law at George Washington University and a board member of the Journal of National Security Law and Policy. I'll turn it over to Ken now.
Okay, I want to thank FPRI and especially Raleigh and Eli Gilman for facilitating this. I'm getting used to Zoom. It'll take quite a while, I'm afraid, but we better get used to it because it's going to be Zoom. Things are only going to be virtual in the future. Raleigh has done an adequate introduction of Paul Rosenzweig. He has done in his time more things than I can possibly imagine. If I have a career anymore, it's probably 7 or 8, but he's done much more than that. I've been fooling around with cybersecurity since 2012, holding events, writing on the topic, trying to understand. And I must say that I still don't understand. But I should say that in the first event I did in 2012, which included a couple of ex-CIA directors and Mike Casey, former Attorney General, and Jim Woolsey and others, Stuart Baker mainly. The only thing that came out of that 2012 Hill session was a pronouncement by Attorney General Casey. His conclusion was that when new threats appear, he's referring to cyber threats, when new threats appear, the law should step aside. I don't know how Paul feels about that, but at any rate, in a subsequent event, a young lawyer opined that private sector offense as a form of cyber defense was legal. Another more senior and national security oriented expert on that same panel argued that the way to deal with cybersecurity was the same problem as how to eat an elephant. The answer is one bite at a time. In 2018, I felt that most cyber issues would never be resolved and new ones would pile upon the old ones indefinitely. As Raleigh has said, the current project name is National Security and Related Tech and Cybersecurity Issues. So far, we've treated counterintelligence and cybersecurity, the issue of encryption and law enforcement, cyber and the US economy, the coming threat of quantum computing, and the battle with disinformation last month. I've asked Paul to give us his views on what cybersecurity issues can be solved and what our priorities ought to be. And I've sent him a list of the things that are on my mind, and but I want him to take the lead on this. I don't feel that I'm in the position to speak to priorities yet, but we'll get there in the end, I think. So Paul, please.
Well, thanks for having me. And I should preliminarily note that while you were talking, the electricity here in Costa Rica went out. I'm running on battery, and the battery may very well die out on us. I don't know what its status was, in which case we'll have to resume at some point, for which I apologize, but it's one of the joys of living in a foreign country, an insecure electric grid, which I suppose is a good introduction, because I do think that one of the major problems that we have yet to address is how better to integrate the national security imperative of American cybersecurity with the reality that somewhere on the order of 80 to 90% of our vulnerable assets are held in private hands. And that's really quite different than the traditional paradigm of national security, where a wholly owned American military fights a wholly owned Russian military, or sometimes fights irregular troops. It's almost as if we lived in a world where every GM plant were responsible for its own anti-aircraft defense. And that reality, that that the cyber network is a distributed network that is disorganized and disaggregated, is a real challenge for effective governmental policy making. It means that we can't proceed in the same kind of hierarchical manner that we proceed with in defending the nation from an air assault, but we have to develop new mechanisms for doing so. And we've made a decent amount of progress thus far, but we really have a long way to go. And if I could identify why it is we have a long way to go, I would say top of mind is that we can't figure out how to actually measure what we're doing. Cybersecurity is really an art still. It's not a science. If I deploy a new firewall, I know I'm getting more secure, but I don't know how much more secure I'm getting. And if I can't measure that, I can't compare different approaches. I can't allocate resources amongst different possible ways of defending myself, nor for that matter, different ways of developing attack capabilities. We have no cyber equivalent, to put it in the basic military terms. We have no cyber equivalent of doing a battle damage assessment. And that's really challenging, to act in a world that is exclusively qualitative instead of quantitative. And so if I had to, at a meta level, define the one challenge I would like to see us talk about more, it's quantifying cybersecurity.
Okay. Wally, you feel free to join in. I'm just making a note. Well, that's very interesting.
Sorry about that. I agree completely with Paul's assessment. It's very amorphous, and it's hard to measure impact and response. And while this is much more Paul's area than mine, I think the lack of borders to this problem is also new, in that the legislation hasn't caught up. The laws across international borders and jurisdictions haven't caught up to the problem. And that, plus the rate of change in the technology, it's really very, very difficult to fight a problem when by the time you have a solution, it's morphed into a new technical issue.
I think that that latter point also resonates with another strategic challenge. One of my friends says, in this world, the attackers are 2 years ahead of defenders. The defenders are 2 years ahead of the legislators, and the legislators are 2 years ahead of the regulators. And what that really reflects is that our traditional methods of a set of approaching management of problems are hierarchical. We are using systems of government we developed in the 1700s and the 1800s and the 1900s to deal with a 21st century problem that morphs at the rate of speed that is, essentially the speed of light. One of my friends, another one of my colleagues says, we're using a big army approach to an area where we need special forces qualities instead. Distributed, push decision-making down as far as you can, and encourage innovation and creativity at the lowest possible decision-making level. That means loss of control, loss of centralization, which is antithetical to how Washington operates and thinks of itself these days. But that way is the essential way forward for whatever it is we're going to do.
But what about, Paul, as I think about it too, and this would be certainly way more your area than mine, but just the legal framework we have in liberal democracies such as our own and our Constitution that embodies things like the Fourth Amendment and privacy rights make it difficult for us to deal with cybersecurity protection. And I just throw that out to you. Would you agree?
Oh, I think it's very clear. Well, when I teach my cybersecurity law and policy class, I say that we are trying to pour new wine into old bottles. And sometimes that works, but sometimes the problem is we need to build new bottles. I'll give you one perfect example. The way in which people protect their cell phones is through passwords, right? Or through facial recognition technology. Two choices. You can use a face to open your phone, or you can use a password to open your phone. Everybody in my space thinks that biometrics are a better, more secure way of actually protecting the information on your phone. On the other hand, the Fifth Amendment law protects your privilege against self-incrimination only as to the password, not as to the facial recognition. So what we have here is a disconnect between what is technologically most valuable, which would be biometric locking of cell phones and cameras and things like that, and a legal protection that extends only to the actual password, the 1278632 password that you might type in, and not to the facial recognition technology. It's really quite fascinating.
What's interesting to me about what you've said, Paul, is that it reminds me an awful lot of Chris Brose's new book, which you may or may not know about. It came out a couple of months ago, and I cannot recall the name of it, but essentially, Chris picks up on the very problem of the old forms of military organization. He was the staff director of Senate Armed Services Committee and worked with John McCain. But anyway, Chris's book is quite worthwhile and quite startling. And there was if you can't get that, you may be able to get the Foreign Affairs article that he published I think it was probably last spring. At any rate, something to pay attention to. I've been trying to involve Chris in this project, but he seems to be too busy. He's now has a Silicon Valley startup.
Don't make money. Why?
And he's a fellow at Carnegie Endowment. So,
that actually raises yet another one of our really big strategic problems, which is that we have a huge human capital deficit in this space, in large part because here even more than in any other area, it is the incentives are much disaligned with the needs of the government. You can make so much more money out in Silicon Valley if you have technical chops than you can in government. And that's true throughout government, whether you're a doctor who works for the VA or outside, or an economist who works for the Bureau of Labor Statistics versus outside. All of that is true throughout government, but it's especially true, doubly true, triply true here. You can leave, if you're a cyber warrior and you've gotten your training at NSA or US Cyber Command, you can go out and go defend a private network and quintuple your salary overnight.
Yeah. So what's your assessment of any progress that's been made in recruiting talent?
There are a couple things that are happening that I think are positive signs. The first is that the government is slowly learning to model its retention policies around a shorter cycle time in this space. So we'll take you, you promised me 4 years, I'll give you a lot of good training, but doing so knowing up front that it's only going to be 4 years. Unlike, say, Air Force pilots that we want to keep them for 12 or 20 years. We know that we're only going to keep these guys for 4 or maybe a second cycle of 8. The second thing that has really taken off in the Obama administration, one of the things they did very well, it has atrophied a little in the Trump administration for lack of attention, is programs for bringing in people from the outside on short-term, 2-year detail projects. You work for Google, come help us. The initial model of that, people will remember, was the absolute failure of President Obama's Medicare websites, the Obamacare websites. And on a crash basis, they brought in people from Google, Facebook, Microsoft to reprogram the site, reconfigure all the intake and outgo, and that became a program at GAO called 18F, after 18th and F Streets, where they now have a routine cycling in of people with large-scale expertise who will give us 2 years, pick up a project. Let's reconfigure the IRS's database, which desperately needs it, or something like that, and bring it out of this 1960s to the 2010s or 2020s. And that works great.
Paul, I think you get at something that is a real core issue, and that's the flexibility of the bureaucracy. Having come out of the intelligence community where they have a real need for technical expertise, as you know, the pipeline to get your clearance approved is just so slow that unless you're expedited, have a special check against your name to get it really rammed through quickly, it can take a year or more, particularly if you've got overseas experience or hard languages, which often complement those technical skills.
Right.
Ironically, slow down the process.
To that, I would add that in this space, in the cybersecurity space, it is a cultural reality that many of the people that we might want to recruit come from backgrounds that are discordant with traditional government, military, OD&I, Department of State kind of button-down conceptions. If any of your viewers have ever been to DEF CON or Black Hat, which are two hacker conventions that happen yearly in Las Vegas, they are fascinating technically, but they are also truly cultural experiences that most people in Washington have never had. I remember the first time I went to give a talk, they apologized to me that the bar would not be open until 7. And they meant 7 a.m. That's the reality. Some of it's silly reality, like odd hair colors and odd dress, but a lot of it is, past lifestyles that in some contexts are disqualifying. and maybe in this context ought not to be.
So, can I shift a little bit here and ask you what progress you think has been made at the government-private sector interface? Are things, are things better? Are they getting better? Will they ever get better?
Well, you know, it's better now than it was in 2005. I am skeptical that there's a lot more room for growth and improvement because of the dissonance in approaches without a fundamental rethink. You know, in 2005, you know, the private sector was completely on its own, had no connections to the government. The government was completely on its own, had no connections to the private sector. They were like, you know, apples and clouds. They didn't talk the same language. They didn't share the same objectives, nothing. Today, we have some pretty robust information sharing technologies available that allow us to, on an automated basis, convey information about threats and vulnerabilities that are reasonably actionable. We have also built some capability to share information at a more granular and classified level, though that is very limited. But we have yet to truly find a way to incentivize private sector actors to act in something other than their own self-interest. And that's, you know, understandable, right? They're profit-making institutions. They're not going to spend money to protect somebody else that doesn't go to their bottom line, even if it's just in reputational value.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the government, we've already talked about the inefficacy of government regulatory approaches because they're too slow for this dynamic environment. We have not identified any other approach that might work. You know, you could think of tax incentives or subsidies, and you can think of procurement preferences and trying to let the market work. You could think of something more grand like a liability revolution, where you're liable for harm to others that's caused by your own negligence in not improving your cybersecurity. But that actually circles back to one of those fundamental strategic problems I started with. We can't have a liability system until we can measure what negligent is, right? Until we can define it. You know, we know what a negligent car looks like because it's X% less safe than another car. It blows up with an X, Y more frequency. We don't know what that is in cyber.
I have a lot of questions. I don't want to necessarily go into content moderation because we did that last time. But while you were talking, I was thinking, and we're lagging behind Taiwan in the reporting circumstance. I understand now that on Taiwan, hostile stuff is known about at the highest levels within 2 hours. And there are no memos that say, okay, this is what happened last week, last year, that nobody reads anyway. But they're reported, and Taiwanese have the advantage, of course, of being a smaller target. And their concerns, of course, China, not everything else under the sun, although I'm sure their economy has been affected. Can you give us just let me ask you, what did you think of the Cyberspace Stellarium Commission?
I give it a B to a B plus, right? The original Stellarium Commission was really far more outside the box, right? It was intentionally so.
Yeah.
The commission set itself a more modest goal. And so that was a little, not disappointing. Because it was self-limited, it's okay. But, I would have liked somebody to try and think about what cybersecurity should look like 20 years from now instead of 5. But given that self-limitation, they did a very good job of identifying a number of recommendations, some of which I actually disagree with, and some of which I find are very useful. To return for the third time in this discussion to my pet rock of measurement, they called for the establishment of a cybersecurity statistics agency of some sort. It's not clear whether that'll ever happen, where it will reside, or what it will measure, but simply the recognition of this as a strategic problem was near and dear to my heart. Other aspects of what they did, speaking to the human capital problem, very useful. I thought I personally am less enamored of the national sector idea, a more centralizing force. As we spoke about earlier, I think that hierarchical responses to a distributed problem are going in the wrong direction. I think to the extent we practically can within a government that must always be somewhat hierarchical, we need to let the form follow the function. And so we need to be more distributed. So that was going in the wrong way. I think the best thing about it, the very best thing about it, was that it was actually comprised of people who are some of whom are members of Congress. And so they may actually do something, which would just be great.
Yeah, I read the Politico report every morning, and essentially report on legislation or the lack thereof. And I begin to wonder if it's worth my time to look at that stuff. And you broke up just as you were talking about centralization of things. What is the title of that the commission gave the White House office that they want established?
You ask me a detailed question like that. I think it's National Director of Cybersecurity.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
And that to me just seems, I mean, look, I understand the need for coordination across a big government, but that seems to centralize more authority in a world in which I want to expand the possibilities, not contract them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And by the way, I should mention, this is actually a change for me. In 2010, I wrote a paper asking for a national cybersecurity director. And I've just changed my mind after 10 more years of experience, which of course means that I may not be right. Now, I might have been right then and wrong now, or I might be right now, and I don't know.
Okay.
I want to be humble-ish.
I was going to ask you, just changing direction a bit. I guess the basic question is, are First Amendment and privacy considerations all but done for? And in a way, this has to do with content moderation. There was a very amusing piece in the Post a couple of weeks ago or a week ago by Sonny Bunch, who says, if you don't like censorship by corporations in the form of advertising withdrawal, as in the case with Facebook, go to physical media. And there things can't be posted, one day and then removed the next. And that brought me back to something that we talked an awful lot about in 2012, which was redundant systems and what else? The notion that at least in the private sector, there ought to be a return to sort of primitive, what I think you would call primitive reactions to cyber attack. And which is to say, you just get off the interweb. Mm-hmm. And I've not heard anything about that lately, but I think Sonny Bunch was trying to entertain us more than anything.
Yeah, no, I have a few. I mean, the first, of course, is that much as we would dream about getting off the network, we're not going to. The efficiencies are too great. The enhanced economic value is too great. I mean, look at what we're doing today, right? The entire world's response to the COVID crisis would be, orders of magnitude less successful in the absence of Zoom and stuff like that. So we're not getting off.
What about what's the term? Not designated networks, but separate networks for, say,
segregated networks?
Yeah.
Well, there's two things about that. I think that to some degree, the future does lie in trusted networks, right? There'll be a trusted financial network that you and I will be on, where identity is always known and must be proven. I would say that that we should not be too sanguine about the security of trusted networks, right? After all, every one of the intelligence failures that we've had in the last few years has been because somebody penetrated a trusted network, Snowden being the most obvious recent example, or Schulte at the CIA. The second thing I think I see coming is the fracturing of the web into two broader networks: a authoritarian network, kind of centered in Russia, China, and maybe some of the third world that affiliates with them, and a more liberal, with a small L, democracy, liberal West network. That also includes Japan and Australia, right? Even though they're not in the West, where values of free speech remain pretty well protected, though likely subject to some forms of limitation because of the way in which the Russian disinformation campaigns have demonstrated our vulnerabilities. Right?
What's your reaction to the latest DOJ proposition on limiting liability?
For
this is Bill Barr's long-standing project. I mean, I think our friend Stuart Baker would say we'll see an end to end encryption.
We never will see an end to end encryption. I think Stuart's got a pipe dream there. For one thing, banning it in the United States would mean import and export restrictions. Because we couldn't ban its creation in Germany or France or wherever.
Right.
And there'll be some places where it will be legal to make. How would you implement an import or export, an import control for a non-corporeal good, right? It's easy to have an import ban on fruit from Mexico. You can't have and even that we can't do perfectly well, but you can't have one. You would either have, I actually wrote some stuff on this with Michael Chertoff. You either have to have a virtual scanning wall at the virtual border that prohibits the importation of packets of information, utterly ineffective, completely subsumed by VPNs, and of course it makes us look just like China, which is not exactly a good look. or you have to mandate that the developers of operating systems, the next higher level up, Apple, Microsoft, Google, and the Android, build their systems in a way that prevents the download and implementation of end-to-end encryption systems at that level. Which means, of course, that would be all end-to-end encryption systems, including the end-to-end encryption that protects yours and my banking online, or the secure transmission of medical data. So I don't think it's a square that can be circled or a circle that can be squared, which is the analogy. I'm really skeptical of that as a practical matter.
Yeah, yeah. Raleigh?
I'm just listening. Nothing to add at this point.
Oh, there's so many things that one could go into, and my list is has not been decreased much. If I were to ask the sort of naive question as to, the initial problems of cybersecurity, I remember maybe it was 2014, I did an event at George Mason Law School, and I got a great response to all sorts of things, and but they were typified by my friend Jeremy Rapkin, who said, well, we just need a bunch of 14 or 15-year-olds to step up and fight back when it comes to cyber defense, and nobody shouted him down. Including the congressman who was present. But at any rate, the privacy issue is not,
I think, as in any area of expertise, the distribution of talent is a bell curve. Right? And China is succeeding to a large degree because it's created a huge number of B and B plus people, right? America's competitive disadvantage is that up until now, we've gotten by responding with a much smaller number of A plus and A people. Call them cyber Jedis if you want. But we have not built the pipeline to back them up with the legions of Bs and B pluses that they need. So we do a good job of creating A minuses and As. And you can't create A pluses. A pluses are born, not made, right?
Right.
But we don't do a good job of, and we create a lot of C's and C pluses. The IT technicians who will reprogram your router, and who are very good at what they do, right? But have a narrow, and they can configure your firewall, bam, right?
Yep.
But they can't. There's a gap there of your B's, B pluses. I'm not really expressing it well, but the view that you attribute to Jeremy is one that I profoundly disagree with.
Well, yeah, obviously, but at the time, as I say, he got away with it, and he also raised the issue of privateers.
That's another one. You mentioned that in your intro, the idea of private sector actors hacking back against foreigners. I wrote a small paper about that for Stanford a few years ago. Let's leave aside the question of whether or not that's legal under American law. It probably is illegal, but that's a solvable problem, because if Congress wants to, we can change that law and authorize private sector actors to respond to attacks. The question is, what about the rest of the world? And let's also leave aside the fact that if we authorize that for Americans, then that means that the Russians are going to authorize it in reciprocal contact. And let's leave aside the fact that if our American private sector actors are wrong, they might mistakenly attack China when it's really Russia and start World War III. Let's leave all that aside. What it means is, A, we're encouraging American actors to violate the domestic law of China or Russia or Germany, because for sure, no matter what it's authorized for us, it will be illegal in the law of the target country, even our friends, right? Nobody's going to have a law that says, okay, it's perfectly legal for Americans to hack French companies. And secondarily, there is no international law that would authorize this. We authorize international law countenances espionage, but this wouldn't be espionage. This would be, violent in quotes response. And it isn't piracy or privateering. But even if it were piracy or privateering, the old law restricted that to the high seas, to the areas of the universal jurisdiction of mankind. It did not, even international law back then did not authorize piracy or privateering within 12 miles of the border, a cannon shot 3 miles, 12 miles, depending upon the territorial sea rules of a nation state. So you could not chase a pirate into territorial waters, and a pirate could not be authorized to attack within territorial waters. Raleigh mentioned the difficulty of jurisdiction or borders in this world. And that's one of these ones where if we were really going to do that, we'd have to find a completely new bottle to pour this cyber privateer wine into. And I'm kind of skeptical of that.
Yeah, understandable. Raleigh, you want to?
I think we're actually getting pretty close to the end. So why don't I throw it out to each of you? Is there anything, and Paul in particular, that we haven't asked about that you think is, it's the catch-all? What did we forget to ask about? What are we missing? What matters that we didn't pay attention to?
We have not seen it yet, but I am persuaded that the next significant cyber threat is from non-traditional, non-state actors. All of the real conflict remains between America and Russia, America and China, or at a much lower level between criminals and law enforcement, which is endemic. We've never seen the equivalent of Al-Qaeda marshaling a cyber attack on the electric grid or on the New York Stock Exchange. The best speculation is that they simply lack that capacity still. It's not as easy as people think it is. But my expectation is that that is not true on a timescale of the next 10 years, or will not remain true on the timescale of the next 10 years. That's a guess.
Yeah.
Worth what you just paid for.
That to me is interesting because, again, I think part of the thinking has been on the old nuclear model, mutually assured destruction actually protects the big state actors. But that doesn't come into play with a rogue force that's a small, terrorist, because in some cases they are suicidal. Exactly right.
I mean, the mutually assured destruction, or we sometimes call it mutually assured disruption model in cyber, is why, notwithstanding everything, we really haven't seen significant catastrophic disruptions so far, because the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans and the Israelis and the Japanese have all been self-restraining for that very reason. You are precisely right that I worry about the irrational actor who's non-deterrable, who actually thinks that showing how bad nuclear power is so important that they'll blow up a nuclear power plant, right? because that'll change the world, or you know, or destroy the New York Stock Exchange because they're anti-capitalist, or you know, pick your irrational actor.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We one of the other things that concerns me is, you know, we talked about technology advancing so quickly, but what we're seeing more and more is not just singular technologies, but the combination of technologies used in tandem or even more. And in terms of national defense, I think that's a particular problem. And I would imagine it would apply to cyber as well.
It is, and the combination of insecurity in cyber and these new technologies. My gravest fear is an AI-enabled drone force that we use as an attack function that gets hacked and turned against us, right?
Yeah. Well, I think we've covered about what I wanted to get out of this this event, and thank you, Paul. Pleasure to see you finally.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. This was a lot of fun. It was a good talk.